Patsy's breast augmentation, cancer, and body image. Part 1. Introduction. When we look at the medical history of Patsy Ramsey, a picture begins to form. And it's not just of health challenges, but of identity, image, and the way trauma reshapes a family. Long before the media circus, before the unimaginable tragedy of JonBenet's death, Patsy Ramsey made choices about her body that reflected what you might seem to think as deeper concerns about control, perception, and worth. So in this episode, we begin unraveling a quiet but powerful thread, the intersection of augmentation, cancer, and the shifting foundation of the Ramsey marriage. What did these choices say about Patsy as a woman in the 1980s? How did cancer treatment and body image collide? And in the wake of JonBenet's death, what remained of that sense of self? And so I want to start at the beginning, where you have a young woman who is a pageant queen and a newlywed, making a decision that would later resurface under the most tragic circumstances. Hello. Welcome back in this next series of videos. I want to kind of talk through some of the issues that I think were present in the Ramsey household, and were sort of underlying what you might call like a gingerbread house, and kind of looking at the really the mindsets of the people involved in this case. But before I do that, I want to send a special shout out to Pill Poppin' Polly for a donation to the channel. Polly, I appreciate you. Want to send out a huge shout out. Once again, a big hug. Polly, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy this next video. So let's look at part 2 in the early stage in the body image development. You have Patsy Ramsey, who had a breast augmentation either in 1982 or 1983, but shortly after marrying John Ramsey in 1980. And so at this time, Patsy probably would have been around 25 or 26 years old at the time. And so while augmentation, I think, was becoming more common during this area, I think, particularly among women in the public eye, I think the timing and motivation offer insight into how Patsy saw herself and what expectations she may have carried into her marriage. So in the transcripts, Patsy says, I had a breast augmentation. Now the world will know. And this is when she's in 1997, she's talking with Thomas Trujillo. And at that point, John and Patsy were still building a life together. You have Patsy, who is a former Miss West Virginia. She was navigating what it meant to transition from the public beauty queen to private wife and mother. So the spotlight is kind of being taken away from her, or she's giving up the spotlight. And so the augmentation was done in Atlanta, and as confirmed by both John and Patsy. But the procedure wasn't just cosmetic. It would later intersect with the most serious health battle of her life. And just kind of looking at the fact that Patsy was probably 22 or something like that when she married John. She met John at, I think, age 20. Or I think it was about age 22 when she met John in 1978, and probably around 24 or something like that when they married in 1980. So like I said, moving up to about age 25 or 26 when she actually, or something of that nature, when she actually got the augmentation. And that kind of gives you an insight into her perspective as a young lady at 25. She's coming from being Miss West Virginia. She was going for, I think, Miss America. And so you kind of wonder if those dreams are still in the back of her mind She wants to marry John. He's got money. He's a hotshot, but she doesn't really want to give up that drive, that hunger to be on a big stage as a pageant queen. She doesn't want to give that dream up just yet. And so you wonder if the augmentation or the changes that she's making to herself are for this continued effort toward the pageant world, or if there's a remembrance of this Gloria character, and maybe there's concern that a kind of Gloria might pop up again at some point in time, because she's already confronted Gloria. But is there a concern that just in case a Gloria pops up again, I want to make sure as a woman that I am well prepared to sort of defend my ground or maintain the vision or the perspective or the attention of my man. And so, I mean, several things can be true at once. Could have been done to maintain the intention of her husband. Could have been done also too because it would be a benefit in the pageant world if she was still, looking to be in the pageant world, because she had not yet had Burke. She doesn't have any kids yet. She's still living her life. She's getting jobs. And so it could have been for several reasons, but also it could have been a childhood dream of hers that she wanted to do this. Ever since she was a child, maybe she saw somebody on TV do it. And so therefore she thought that, hey, I might get this for myself. And so it's quite interesting, the reasons that she did this. And so moving on. So at that point, John and Patsy, they're building their life together. Patsy's a former Miss West Virginia, navigating what it means to go from that beauty queen into being where she's the it factor to being a private wife and eventually a mother. Well, no, she's a stepmother at this point. Going into that role and saying, does she feel like she's losing a step a little bit internally? She will never say that out loud. She will never frame it that way. But does Patsy Ramsey feel like she's giving up a lot of her independence in as a woman walking into this marriage? That becomes my concern, because in later episodes, later ways in which a person acts when they evolve, because I think you evolve or you grow into a different person like every 5 years or something like that. And so if Patsy is evolving and she's getting older, she's becoming wiser. And so you're wondering, is part of this growth in this wisdom and this experience in life having something to do with Patsy saying, well, I gave up opportunities for the benefit of his other children, and I became a mom solely really for his benefit. I gave myself up, for his benefit. And maybe now it's time for me to do more. You wonder if that stuff comes back later on in life. And you wonder if this is sort of that step in that direction. And so, because women, just because they have a child, they don't want to lose a step. They don't want that to stop them from being the thriving person that they were prior to children. I've gone through different forums and things of that nature in different videos on social media. And I remember seeing this one young lady, very beautiful. And she was, I think she was a rapper is what she was. And she was getting signed and getting great opportunities. But I think after she had mentioned, and she loves her kids, but after having that first kid, it just really did something to her. Just, there's all kinds of feelings that you get when you have a child. It just absolutely throws your body out of whack. And so you're trying to, after you have a child, you're trying to maintain a sense of self and who you are after you have a child. And you're trying to get back in the gym, you're trying to work out, and you're trying to, keep your man's eyes on you while trying to find the space of grace for yourself to say, well, man, I just had a kid, give me give me a break a little bit, give me an opportunity to rest. And so you're thinking about that. And but also you're saying, well, I do want to, for me as a person, I do want to get back in shape. I do want to get back to work. I do want to feel like I'm valuable to the world. I do want to feel like my old self. And, I think she's going back to school and she's really just, doing her thing. And, kudos to her, and still raising. I think she's had 2 more kids since then. And, still raising, I think still with her, I think her husband, but raising the kids and going back to school in the medical field. But sometimes those desires, from a patriarchal standpoint, can be considered. I've seen, I was seeing in reference to her, can be seen as selfish motives. And even though you may be a strong person, as Patsy Ramsey may have been, sometimes the things that people say, they get to you, and you don't want to come off as selfish, but you do want to get out and have a little fun at some point. And so getting back to my original point with Patsy, you do wonder the perspective about Patsy in terms of where was this pressure coming from to do this? Is this a Patsy thing? Is this a, hey, for my birthday, I'm going to get this cosmetic procedure done for me because I want it, because I want to get back to being that fun, spunky, spontaneous Patsy, and I want to do this to show that I'm still a mom or I'm still Patsy, even though I'm a mom. And then sometimes for cosmetic reasons, it's because, hey, I don't like the way my body looks right now. So I want to get it back to where it was, or what have you. I don't know. But I mean, Patsy hadn't had kids yet. And she's young. So she still should have been good. But, you never know. But anyways, John Ramsey confirms that the surgery took place after their marriage. So giving it context within their relationship, and this is 2 years in. Pretty soon into, and I don't even know if they had money like that yet. I don't even know if they were rolling in dough like that yet, I guess is my concern. So John Ramsey confirms it, doesn't seem to have a problem with it. Also seems to have been aware of the potential medical implications of the later on issues, though he ultimately downplayed them. So in 1998, he's talking to Mike Cain, and he says she had it done originally in Atlanta and they ruptured, which was discovered during her cancer treatment. So even back then, John admitted he wondered whether there was any link between the implants and her cancer. And so while the doctor didn't believe there was any correlation, the fact that this question was on his mind suggests just how deeply the surgery and its aftermath affected their shared life. He's thinking about this stuff later on, how it comes up later on. So it's on his mind. He's well aware of the surgery, even enough to ask questions about it. Well, I know that she's done this. And so he goes on to say to Mike Cain, he says, I wondered about that. That's one of the things I looked at when I was studying what was going on. And so once it ruptures, he's trying to study, he's trying to figure out, is there any link? That's like the first question when he talks about cancer. Does the rupturing, and I mean, it's a natural question, right? Does the rupturing have anything to do with my wife's cancer? And could be 2 reasons why he's asking that. Number one, could be the question and the research, resulting research because of guilt. I told my wife to do this, or I insinuated that my wife should do this, or maybe my wandering eyes maybe insinuated as my wife watched me, because this is the thing about women. Women may not say anything, but they watch you. They watch your eyes. They watch your body language. And I think men take that for granted sometimes, that women are actually watching them. I mean, because we're human, right? Everybody's human. So when you're with a partner, you're watching always, whether you know it or not, to make sure to see if they're still interested in you. And I think that Patsy is a very, I guess you would say, observant person. She's very observant, and she doesn't say a lot of things, I think, but she just observes. And because Patsy may come off as ditzy sometimes in her responses, or her responses aren't as sharp, or they're not as quick, I think people forget that Patsy was not a slouch. I think people forget that Patsy was not a slouch in high school or in college. Let's get that straight. You know what I mean? Patsy was not a slouch. She just may not have been quick on her feet. But you could tell from her gathering when she speaks, she gathers a lot when she says, well, she's gathering to say something. And sometimes Patsy thinks things that she doesn't want to let you know that she's thinking. And so she gathers. And when it comes out, it's like, man, dang, it took you that long to say that. And you didn't really even say anything. Well, that might be a pullback where I didn't want you to know that. And so, she's not a slouch. And so she notices things from possibly John Ramsey looking at other women. Maybe, I don't know. I'm just, kind of coming up with a random scenario here. I'm not saying it's true, and I'm not trying to sway your opinion. I'm just saying. But basically, Patsy's watching John, and it's possible that she sees this. Or the second thing is that could be the case that John is just genuinely interested in what's going on with his wife's body, and he wants to know. And so he thinks that, hey, this is maybe a decision that we made together, and I want to kind of see if there's any connection. And again, two things can be true. Could be because of maybe there's guilt, and then maybe also he wants to see if that this has anything to do with it. Because whether he told Patsy to do it or not, she could have done it partially out of an intent to please him in some way. Because maybe, he liked her, but maybe based on what she saw, because we don't know what Gloria looks like. I mean, to be honest with you, we don't know what Gloria looks like. Gloria could have been an absolute bombshell, and she could have been very curvaceous. And then and Patsy's not dumb. So Patsy at 22 sees this I don't know how old Gloria was at the time, but she sees this older woman who may be full figured, and Patsy's like, well, hey, I want to be full figured myself. Just if this is the person that, this is the kind of person that John likes. Maybe he's dated her before. Maybe I need to step my game up. And so, even though John doesn't say anything, under this second scenario, it could still be influenced, but, and he knows that that's something that is in your mental that we can't pull out, but John would know that. And so, moving on, this early decision to undergo augmentation, I think sets a foundation. It reflected not just as a desire for beauty, but a concern with perception, with control, with perfection, traits that, and this stuff is on TV as well, so traits that, as we'll see, would be tested and ultimately reshaped during her cancer battle and its emotional aftermath. So let's move on to the third part, the cancer diagnosis, the treatment, and the surgical complications. So Patsy has these cosmetic changes, and they reemerge unexpectedly during her cancer journey. So in 1993, she's diagnosed with, I think, stage 4 ovarian cancer. I think it was stage 4, or maybe it was a little less. Maybe it was like stage 2 or 3. But anyway, she's diagnosed with ovarian cancer after months of unexplained shoulder pain and abdominal swelling. I think it was, she went to Atlanta, or I think she went and saw her mom, and her mom pointed it out and said that her stomach was getting bigger and bigger. And so the diagnosis, which came while they were in Atlanta, led to a whirlwind of emergency surgeries and an aggressive experimental treatment protocol through the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland. And as if the cancer wasn't enough, her earlier cosmetic surgery came into play. And so in 1997, talking to Thomas Trujillo, she says they were doing a chest x-ray and suspected a rupture. And both breasts, whatever those are, this is what she said in the interview, whatever those are, had ruptured. And this is what she said in 1997. And so the rupture was discovered as doctors scanned her chest during chemo. And her portocath, which is a device used to administer chemotherapy, I think, had to be removed. And a Boulder plastic surgeon, Dr. Rapallo, was brought in to repair the implants. And according to John, this wasn't a minor issue. Her body had been going through trauma after trauma. And this is in 1993 when this is happening. So she's 37. You start to see or something of that nature. You start to see the beginnings, of cracking here. My body is going through not just this trauma, but John calls it trauma after trauma. Trauma after trauma? Because you would think that it just popped up out of nowhere. But apparently her body is going through trauma after trauma. Now that makes me think of JonBenet, to be honest with you, because JonBenet's body went through trauma after trauma. And maybe because, and Patsy often refers to, well, I went through cancer. I didn't have time to think about, doing this to my child or being mad at my child. I was more worried about living life and getting that time back. And then John also backs up that story in that he says, Patsy wanted to just, get every minute out of life that she could after the cancer diagnosis. And so that mindset kind of steps in. And so I think there's a shared dynamic there between Patsy and JonBenet, and that Patsy's body is going through trauma after trauma. And so is JonBenet's body going through trauma after trauma, because as Patsy is dealing with something real in cancer, she's also dealing with something cosmetic at the same time. And I think this is probably the worst case scenario. But her language in 1997, when she's talking to the detective and she says, the doctors had suspected a rupture on both of my implants. And she says, whatever those are. To me, that suggests a level of discomfort talking about this, because, and that's okay, because some people, sometimes when you go to the doctor, it's very matter of fact, right? Sometimes you speak to the doctor and you say, well, I had this surgery and this happened and so this was the outcome. So, and I work very closely with my doctors to get that fixed. So yeah. And it just sits there. That's what it is. I don't need to explain that. I don't need to get fidgety. I don't need to do anything like that. But the fact that Patsy in this case talking about this feels like she needs to fill space here whatever those are. That is interesting to me because it suggests to me a level of, I don't want to call it immaturity, but I do want to call it, a level of discomfort talking about sensitive topics or talking about sensitive things in this manner. And that will play out in your household when you don't want to, maybe you're afraid to talk about the birds and the bees or what have you. Oftentimes when you're uncomfortable talking about certain things, you will cloud it in very colored or colorful language. And I don't mean like cussing and stuff like that, but you'll sort of shape it, I guess, almost protect it or put it in like a little box and say, you know, this is what we don't talk about this. And so you'll try to use language to talk about, you know, to say sometimes like I do when I'm talking to you guys about this stuff. Oh, the box area, the box thing, you know, you'll talk in those terms, the thing in the box. Do you remember the thing in the box? And then people just have to get what you're insinuating kind of deal. And so you have to speak in coded language, essentially. And so Patsy let's say this is 1997. Patsy in 1997 at the age of 41 is speaking about her cosmetic surgery in coded language to another grown man. That shows a level of discomfort around these sensitive areas. And you do wonder, at 41, why is Patsy not able to stand up and just say it and let it be what it is? That becomes my question. Because we do know that Patsy is young. We do know that Patsy is possibly being driven by the older senior husband, the husband who's 14, 15 years her senior or something like that. And so the younger partner will take after a lot of ways and will take after a lot of direction of the older partner. And so because she sees him as mature and she automatically defers to his judgment. And that could show up later in some elements of why you would do certain things. It could show up later in certain elements of the case. In your motivations to write certain things, in your motivations to perform certain actions, especially with respect to the JonBenet case. And to give you a more concrete example, when you go into the transcripts, Patsy asks, when she reads the note, she goes up to John. She gives the note to John and she asks two things. I think I remember seeing in the transcripts. She asks, what can I do? Which is crazy because that's your child. You should know what to do. But she asks, what can I do? Or she asks something to the effect of, how can I help? And that sort of deferral to John seems off. It seems a little bit off because now we are sitting in an interview room to where there is some sort of paternal, automatic paternal relationship. Maybe Patsy sees older men as paternal. And so maybe as a child, she uses coded language. When it comes to these sensitive matters, she regresses to very childlike dispositions. And she says, whatever those are. And earlier on in the transcript, as we talked about, she said, I had this cosmetic surgery. And she says, now the world will know. And it's kind of like giving this, oh God, this is a secret that I don't want anybody to know about. Now the world's going to know. And what's the problem with the world knowing? Saying, I mean, she got this surgery, and it is what it is. Are there some things about the fact that you got this surgery that make you a little uncomfortable? Right? That becomes the concern. Is there something about this surgery that makes you a little bit uncomfortable telling people, hey, I've been enhanced a little bit, and I don't really want to talk about why I was enhanced, because that's my business. And, and I'm just talking, but I bring this up because we are thinking internally about the Ramsey family structure. And we're thinking internally about the Ramsey household and why they do some of the things that they do, and the structure, the familial structure, and the interpersonal relationships happening in the house. Because I think part of the element of this case, and I'm probably overdoing it, so I take that on the chin, is figuring out how these people interacted with each other and why. If we're looking internally, we need to know why these people interacted with each other the way that they did. What are the driving motivations and the factors that made them say certain things to each other, made them act certain ways around each other, made them defer to each other in a certain way? Because you pull out little phrases like this, whatever those are, now the world will know. And it's a sense of reversion and regression back to a childlike state. What is it about John that puts you in sort of this regression back to this childlike state, to where you see maybe an older gentleman, or you see a gentleman in general, maybe just one that's, not too young, maybe one that's your same age. And because I think back to Steve Thomas, and Patsy didn't really fight him. You know what I mean? Patsy didn't really fight Steve Thomas. She didn't really go at him. If you go back and look at the Larry King interview, and you look at the interaction between Steve Thomas and Patsy, John was trying to go at Steve's neck. John was trying to get after Steve. He wouldn't even let him talk. But Patsy was more so allowing Steve to talk. Patsy was almost, in some of her language and some of her sentences, giving sort of deference, might I say, to Steve Thomas. Steve, you can stop me at any point in time. I know I'm talking, and it's like I'm feigning putting up a fight, but I'm not really. I'm not really putting up a fight. Some people might say it's because Steve Thomas, wasn't a bad looking gentleman. And maybe so. Maybe that was the case. I can't take anything from Steve, but it does make me question how Patsy views herself in the world. And so that's very interesting. But anyway, she says, whatever those are. And the rupture was discovered as doctors scanned her chest during chemo. She has her portal cath and all such as that. And her body had been through trauma after trauma. And so she has this portal cath in 1998, talking with Mike Kane, I think John Ramsey. She has this portal cath permanently installed, and during treatment, the implants rupture, and that has to be fixed. And so this wasn't just a technical complication. It was, I think, an identity blow to Patsy. And at a time when she was fighting to live, She was also being forced to reconcile with a body that no longer looked or functioned like it once had. The augmentation, that very augmentation that may have been about youth and image, was now, I think, entangled with survival and loss. And when you get into a stage of survival, you start to think or rethink every decision that you've made. Should I have gotten these implants? Should I have done this? Did I make a mistake? You know what I mean? Like I know that these were on Patsy's mind. And at the time, you're saying, I did this because I just wanted to look more youthful. I just wanted to look better. Or I wanted to look like the women in the commercials or the women on these popular television shows. I just wanted to do that. But is this the thing that's hurting me? I think needs to be talked about. And so John even explores whether these things may have caused the problem. So though his inquiries were met with skepticism by medical professionals, the fact that this crossed his mind does underscore just how deeply this health crisis affected both of their worldviews, because now they're asking questions. And in 1998, I think Phil Clauston is brought up. And he said, I think he told John he didn't feel that there was really any correlation. And he's talking about between the cosmetic surgery and the cancer. And so John says, the doctor is telling me that there's no correlation. But John is saying that, but I do wonder about that. I do think that maybe that's an issue. And so this wasn't merely a medical concern. I think it was also emotional and symbolic. Something from the past had ruptured inside of her. And now they both are having to reckon with that rupturing. We're reckoning with the fact that this is not the same Patsy. You know, it's a different Patsy. It's a different person. And we got to talk about that. I got to think about that. Because no matter how selfish it might be, now Patsy's thinking about herself, of course. She's the one going through all this stuff, you know, the sickness and the rupturing of the cosmetic surgery. But John also, as a husband, did I push her too hard? Did I give off impressions that maybe I shouldn't have? Is this purely something out of my control? And I can imagine him asking Phil Clauston these questions about correlation, because he's maybe asking, is this something out of my control that just happens as, you know, part of life? Or was this always the case? And this is something that would have happened eventually and we just didn't know about it. Right? So they both have these concerns that they're trying to grapple with. Now we want to think about how this may impact their marital dynamics and changing intimacy. You know, you have John Ramsey, who has often spoken about how the cancer battle brought them closer. In some ways, this is true. You have this sort of shared suffering that can create deeper bonds, but it's also clear that the emotional toll affected their physical and relational intimacy in complicated ways. So in 1998, he's kind of saying, to Mike Cain, I think, in an interview, he's saying, I think you grow more deeply in love as your relationship continues. It changes from what was probably maybe more lustful in the beginning to true spiritual love. And that's a very mature thing to say, and things that you have to think about when something like sickness comes on and you go from, as you say, you know, lustful, you know, desires to true spiritual evolved love. And that's saying, I have evolved in my love toward Patsy, you know, beyond just those initial feelings of this initial superficial feelings that I may have felt for her when I was younger. And when we first met, when I looked at her and I said, whoa, she is gorgeous. I'm stunned. You know, this is kind of what John may have been thinking when he first met her. Like, whoa, time stopped. The world stopped. And he's looking at Patsy. He's looking her in her eyes. He's looking at her flowy hair, and he's looking at how she walks and her smile, and how she's looking at him. And John loves it. He loves hey, look, I got to talk to her. I'm in a deep state of depression. Everything is going wrong, as he's talking about, as he says in his book, The Other Side of Suffering. Everything is going wrong, and all such as that. And I'm sleeping. I'm in my friend's house. I'm sleeping in his apartment on the ground, and I'm trying to get myself together. But I can't pass this up. I got to talk to her. And he goes out and he says, man, I do lust after her, which is not a problem. You do want to have those feelings for your partner, but sometimes that sort of lust may drive things of what are you sort of thirsting after in that way, right? What do you want? And so, even though we become close, we become intimate, the implants and the cosmetics come in because you like me, because I'm, and my calling card, if I'm Patsy, my calling card is, hey, I'm a pageant princess. I'm a beauty queen. So you messing with a real one here, so just so you know. And I think once that may become your calling card, you feel like you have to keep up the impressions and stuff like that, which tells us something else about possibly moving forward in the family life. Both of them in some ways, because you can only keep up impressions and keep up, perceptions and things of that nature, trying to manage those perceptions of people. You can only keep up those for a while, for a little bit. And then after a while, your body gets tired, what have you. And so you do then have to try to say, okay, do I really love this person? Right? You have to say, do I really love this person? How do I feel about this person? Can I truly say that I'm down for this person? And that's an internal check. These are things that we don't want to admit, but things that have to be said. I did kind of get with you because I thought you had a nice body, or I thought you had a nice face. I did kind of get with you because you had a nice car, and I thought you had money. That's why I got with you. But now, when all of that is wiped away, do you still love me the same? Has our love sort of transitioned there? Right. And so that's a powerful quote from John. We've transitioned to true spiritual love. We're connected spiritually. We're entangled. We're enjoined. We're intertwined in spirit. And, there was a clip I always remember of John when he was talking about Patsy, and he just, John is a strong person, man. He doesn't like to cry, but he started talking about her. And obviously years later, he just got choked up. And it caught him. And I was like, yeah, that's what I expect. Because Patsy meant that much. That's evidence of that true spiritual love there. And so it's a powerful quote, tells us that something shifted. And while he's describing it in idealistic terms, we do have to ask, did that shift also mean a loss of physical closeness? Did it reflect a form of resignation or emotional compensation? Patsy, she's losing her hair. Maybe she's entering menopause early. The ruptured cosmetic surgery is coming to bear, being repaired during chemo, but she's also going through chemo. She's losing her hair. Her immune system is collapsing more than once during the protocol. And according to John, she's physically incapacitated at times, unable to care for the children. And you got to have a living helper, Susan, I think it was. And this isn't a critique, right? It's just a picture of what long-term illnesses may do to a family, especially to the intimacy of the family, right? Because as a person, you start thinking about your needs. John goes on to say in 1998, I believe, he said there were periods of time. He said something to the effect that there were periods of time that she was actually incapable of parenting. You know, it was a tough time for her, very tough. And so I think he kind of says that, hey, you know, we had to bring in somebody who stayed with us for like a year, right? And so, and still, John admires Patsy. During this time, he recalled how she fought through the sickness, remained positive, held the family together when she could. But the language he uses when he says she was going to beat it, she was a guinea pig. She made the best of it. You know, it paints a picture of a woman fighting for more than life, but fighting for dignity. We go back to the point in which we talked about, if you were with me, we talked about Judith Phillips. And Patsy talks about how Judith wanted to take pictures of her during her cancer diagnosis or just when she was coming out of cancer. And Judith was, you know, female empowerment, I think more feminism based. And so that's what Judith is like. Patsy, you got to get up on the horse, baby girl. You got to get back on it. You know, we can do this. You know, I want to show you, I want to take pictures of you in your cancer diagnosis so that people know, hey, you know, as a woman, you know, no matter what you face, you can fight through this. And that is the dignity, I think, that Judith Phillips was trying to drive into Patsy. But Patsy, I think, was so tired at the time. And she felt so well, I don't really know, because that's hindsight, what she said about Judith Phillips. That's in hindsight when she was, oh, you know, Judith was all on my case. She was all on my back, you know. And I think she mentioned some of this stuff from the death of innocence. And I can't remember what page, but she essentially is saying that Judith was on her back, and Judith was trying to, you know, this whole fiasco about Judith, you know, coming up with these pictures that she wanted to sell, and Judith was going on this talk for money circuit, and you know, that's when Susan Stein had to step in and put Judith Phillips in her place and whatnot. But when you hear it from Judith's perspective, Judith is like, I've been trying to call Patsy, I'd been trying to check on her and see what's up, but you know, things just went silent, they went cold, and you know, I tried to reach out to come talk to her. And when I went to talk to him, you know, I was met with Susan Stein, and Susan Stein basically told me in no uncertain terms, stay away from Patsy. And Patsy's perspective comes from and says, you know, Judith was trying to, you know, she was trying to basically bully me into a photo shoot when I was going through my hair restoration journey after cancer. And I really didn't want to do it. But after a while, I just, you know, had to, you know, oblige, you know, whatever she was asking me to do. And you get the sense that Judith was trying to just help. But John is saying, yep, she was going to beat it. So basically you have two people trying to push her in different ways, but one person kind of gets the credit for it, but the other one doesn't. And Judith Phillips. So you have you paints a picture of a woman who's fighting for her dignity and how she wants that dignity to be shown. I don't necessarily want it to be shown in pictures, but personally, internally, maybe I want to just know that I have my dignity back is kind of possibly the deal. So couple comes out of that year transformed, but you do wonder, was the intimacy ever restored? Did the emotional bond truly replace the physical connection, or did it just become easier to hide behind phrases like spiritual love? Right? I know what you're telling me, but I do know that you are, if you're John, I know that you're, you're a kind of hands-on guy. You know, you got to have that intimacy. You got to have it. So these are definitely questions that linger. And in light of, you know, what would happen just 2 years later, with their daughter, you know, you get in 94 and stuff like that. She goes through this in 93 and then comes out of it in 94, I believe. And 2 years later, you have the issue with JonBenet. We begin to see how maybe accumulated emotional distance can form the cracks beneath what we might see as a polished surface. And so looking at the emotional aftermath and reconstruction in maybe like a part 5. So after the treatment, Patsy tries to return to her life, but it wasn't the same life. Her physical recovery was only part of the story. Emotionally, she had been reshaped, forced to enter early into sort of these different feelings, stripped of, I think, hormonal treatments due to her cancer, still bearing the trauma of aggressive chemotherapy. And so Patsy's post-cancer identity was a reconstruction of both body and spirit. And so while they're growing together spiritually, John and Patsy's spirit is changing. You know, her body is changing, her spirit is changing. Patsy is becoming a different person, not because of time, but because of experience, a deeply traumatic experience. And so I think John says in 98 something to the effect that they gave her some counseling on how she should go on living. And she couldn't, I think, take estrogen. That was a no-no. And she became more health conscious, more present, more aware of time. John recalled her as someone who now lived for the moment, but this awareness also came with subtle grief, the loss of fertility, the loss of bodily control, and possibly the loss of spontaneity in their marriage. Now, I do want to throw a little nugget here. And it said that she becomes more health conscious, more present, more aware of time. She becomes more health conscious. When you become more health conscious, what do? You eat more fruit. I'm just going to leave that right there. When you become more health conscious, you eat more fruit. So John goes on to kind of say that she basically went through menopause because her body was unable to produce estrogen. I think he says that in 1998, talking to Mike Cain. And so that's a physiological sentence, but beneath it is sort of an emotional meaning, the end of a certain expression of womanhood, perhaps before she was ready. And so John is claiming, though, that through this, they're getting closer, that illness changed them from a couple driven by achievement and appearances to more of a solid partnership that is forged through suffering. Kind of a trauma bond in a way, but, you know, that's what you do when you have your partner at that stage. And so John says, you know, he goes on to say something to the effect of, he says, you go through hardships with someone, you bond in a way that you don't bond if you haven't. And so it's notable. That's a notable reflection that he's talking with Mike Cain on. But the reality is that even noble reflections can mask unspoken losses. Was the relationship more spiritual because they matured? Or was it less physical because they were grieving too many things to touch each other? That's a big thing. Are we doing this because we've matured into true spiritual love? Or are we calling it spiritual love because of the circumstances that allow us to say, I just didn't feel drawn to her anymore? Because after a loss like JonBenet, some parents go their separate ways. The weight is too great to bear. So they go their separate ways. However, some people choose to stay together and it works out. They overcome it. But some people may stay together and they never really overcome it. And it shows, not necessarily outspoken, but it shows in a way of, I just don't feel like being touched. And the person who wants to touch reads that and he doesn't say anything. But after a while, you know, he just stops touching, stops interacting. Right. And so what it leads to is that you still have a marriage that's intact, but the cracks that are left by the illness in body and identity and desire never fully disappear. They scar over or they stay tender, waiting to be sort of triggered by another trauma. And so when we piece together this part of the Ramsey family story, what emerges isn't just medical chronology. It's a portrait of a woman under siege. It's a portrait of a marriage tested not by infidelity that we know of, not by fame, not even by sort of the unspeakable loss that could come later, but by a quiet sort of long-term toll of trying to survive. And so just for me trying to survive, some things have to be cut off, right? I don't do certain things, and that may be the loss of my intimacy. And so you have Patsy Ramsey, who was a public woman, former beauty queen, social figure, but in these sort of transcripts, you meet what becomes a very private woman who is managing. So she's public and for what you can see, but I become sort of like very private about certain things, my insecurities. I'm managing this sort of ruptured cosmetic surgery, battling cancer, enduring menopause in my 30s, and I'm carrying the visible and invisible marks of my illness on me, whether you see them or not. And so John's reflections in this case are affectionate, but they're also slightly distant. They're framed through the lens of admiration. I admire her for these things that she's going through, logistics, treatment coordination. But there's less emotion or less mention of emotional processing and more about how they got through it. That's quite consistent with John when he talks about, his relationship with Burke. He was a good kid. He's very responsible. Just admiration. His employers love him. But never really truly affectionate language when he talks about Burke. I love my son. I am proud of my son. He persevered after his mother's death, and he went to college, and he was a great kid. He loves to fly planes, and that's a passion that we share. In fact, lately we just recently we flew together. We did a father-son trip, and we flew over this area together. You never hear those stories from John, right? Things just seem to fall off. And you have to look deeply into that. Why are things just falling off, right? That means something. When John becomes overwhelmed or stressed, or there's a reason for distance, such as Patsy's cancer treatment, he just sort of drifts away. His language changes. It's still there but it almost seems like it's language of duty. I should admire my wife for what she's going through. I should understand this is what we had to do. I had to get JonBenet back. I had to find her. I had to be the hero for her. I couldn't do it for Beth. I didn't know where Beth was, but I had to do it for JonBenet. And we just got through it. I had to be strong. He talks about this in his book. When his kids were going to, when Burke and Melinda and John Andrew were going before the grand jury, I had to be strong for my kids. I had to protect them, but I couldn't protect them in this case. So more about what I have to do and less about anything really emotionally tethered to anything. And so what's clear is that the bottom is that both of them are trying to hold their lives together, sometimes with medication, maybe. We're going to talk about that. Sometimes with routines, sometimes with just sheer will, because you can grow together, but you grow together because of your kids. You really have nothing in common anymore, but because the kids, you got to find your way back on that. And so when the tragedy of JonBenet hit, you already have this fractured body and this fractured bond. And so Patsy is fractured in this way. But you also have this bond that's fractured, and they're forced to now carry another unbearable weight. So it's tempting to sanitize these realities, right? By saying, oh, we just had to get through it. We just had to do what we had to do. It is what it is. Did you ever think about this? Not really. We were spiritually matured. So it's tempting to sanitize these realities because you want to remember it in a positive way. But the real emotions, but the way you code the language shows that it can tell the true intent. So the illness, especially when mixed with beauty standards, surgical enhancements, and public scrutiny, is never clean. It's layered. It's messy, deeply human. And so I want to close out. I want to close out by saying that this isn't just a story about survival. There's an element of control here about appearances, about image management, and about what gets hidden under the surface of a manicured life. Patsy's decision to undergo this cosmetic surgery in her 20s, I don't think was random. I think it was a signal that she had internalized possibly certain expectations about what a woman, a wife, and a mother should be, and I'm just kind of speculating at this point. Whether it came from family values or social pressures or personal insecurity, she responded. An option for her was to alter her body. Maybe not because she was vain, but because appearance mattered. She knew it, and so did John. So that years later, during cancer, when the cosmetic surgery or the cosmetics go wrong, that rupture, physical as it was, also revealed something symbolic. It really pulled back the curtain of the polished image that she built, and that image that began to fracture under real pressure. You're seeing the real person. And so you look at John, whose descriptions of their marriage, deepening through hardship, as he calls it, they sound noble, but they also seem to avoid something. He doesn't talk about how the physical and emotional changes may have created distance. He doesn't engage the psychological weight that comes from body altering illness, layered on top of years of performance and public facing perfection. We're not going to talk about that. There's a psychological weight that comes from, because you have a mask on this entire time. You have a mask. But he doesn't acknowledge that. He doesn't acknowledge that mask, right? So what does that tell you? It tells you that from the outside, things looked fine. Right schools, the right parties, the right family. We're doing everything right. But on the inside, there are unspoken tensions. You have body image. You may have marital strain, which is normal. You have emotional suppression. And so you may not be looking at as much of a resilient foundation as you think, but you might be looking at a fragile one, built on roles, on control, on silence. And by the time JonBenet dies, the silence has already been practiced for years. I'll leave you with that. By the time JonBenet comes on, this silence, this way of dealing with things, this way of suppressing things, is normal. I'm going to leave it right there. But let me know what you think. Like, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. Appreciate you watching. Appreciate you for supporting. And until next time, take care of yourself, love on yourself, and take it easy.